Welcome to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and I'm joined once again, as always, by Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, great to have you.
Brandon, always a joy to be on with you.
So what's been going on, Bishop Barron? You just finished a few weeks of grueling travel. Now I'm guessing you finally have some time to catch your breath.
Yes, it's been one of the busiest periods I've ever had in my professional life. And that's because I had all my responsibilities here, doing confirmations and many other things. And then I was just on the road constantly. Most recently now, I'm back from both New York and Washington. In New York, I was part of this really interesting conversation between Jews and Catholics. Cardinal Dolan invited me to be on this committee. So we had an all-day meeting in New York. Also had a chance, though, to celebrate Cardinal Dolan's 40th priestly anniversary with him and many other people. And I stayed with him, which was a great joy. So we were able to smoke cigars, late into the night and talk about everything. So that was a joy. Then I went right from New York to Washington because I was invited to speak to the American Enterprise Institute. And I stayed with Cardinal Wuerl this time. And we went to a wonderful event the night before the AEI talk. It was a fundraiser for Catholic schools in Washington. And both John Boehner, the former speaker, and Paul Ryan, the current speaker, were there because they support this fundraising effort. So that was very interesting to meet the two of them. And then I gave this talk. Cardinal Wuerl gave the first keynote. I gave the last one, the end of the day. But all kinds of interesting people, from Robert George to Mary Eberstadt to Michael Novak to E.J. Dionne, were there for this conference. So that was very interesting. But then I had the long slog back. I'm realizing these flights from the East Coast out to L.A. are, like going to Europe. So I was pretty exhausted when I got back. And now I've been sort of easing into more of a vacation period here.
So you have a few weeks coming up here without any major travel. So what does a bishop do to unwind in Santa Barbara?
Well, I'll tell you what I do is I spend more time in prayer in my chapel. I spend more time reading the paper and having my coffee. I walk on the beach, which I love here. But also, I spend time reading really boring, serious books. Because one thing I'll confess to you is that I miss in my life now is the academic side. I'm an academic at heart. Most of my life is spent reading serious books and teaching and thinking. And I've got so many administrative responsibilities now and, practical pastoral responsibilities that I don't have as much time to do that. So I sit down when I want to relax. I get a big, fat, really difficult, serious book of theology and read it with a pen in my hand and take notes on it. So I'll do that. And but the walks on the beach will be a big part of it. And then I'll catch up at the end of the day, maybe on watching some of these TV programs that people keep talking about that I haven't had a chance to see. So that's sort of my method for relaxation.
Well, every week here on the Word on Fire show, we typically have a conversation about a topic, and then at the end of the show, we take one question from one of our listeners. However, over the past couple months, the questions have been pouring in. We're so thrilled to hear this because it means that so many people are interested in asking you questions about so many different topics. So every couple months, we like to just take a whole episode and devote it to the questions from our listeners. So that's what we're going to do here today. We've chosen about 7 or 8 questions, and we're going to go through them somewhat rapid fire. And the first one comes from Brianna. Brianna lives in Philadelphia, and she has a question about how teachers in Catholic schools can make it through the day. So here's her question for Bishop Barron.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Brianna from the suburbs of Philadelphia. And my husband and I are both teachers at a Catholic school. And I wanted to know if you had any advice for other teachers who teach in Catholic schools or for teachers who are Catholic and teach in public schools. Thanks so much.
Well, good. First of all, thank you for your service. It's extremely important in the life of the church. I think the most important thing you do is model the Catholic life for your kids. So you'll be teaching them important things, obviously, and even about the faith. But maybe most important is your witness, that your joyful embodiment of the Catholic life will stay in the minds and hearts of your students probably longer than what you're teaching them. So I would say that is let them see that you're a faithful, happy, integrated Catholic and that it's informing your life at all levels. That will impress them in a way that maybe that you won't see immediately, but you'll be planting seeds. So I would say that for you and your husband is just to model what it looks like to be a faithful, integrated Catholic.
The next question comes from Andrew in Kentucky, who's wondering whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God or if there's any distinction between the two. So here's Andrew.
My name is Andrew from Kentucky. There's been a lot of discussion this week with regard to whether Muslims and Christians worship the same God. What are your thoughts on this issue? To what extent do you believe that other religions do in fact worship the same God? And what are the limits on what a Catholic can accept with regard to other religions?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a complicated question, and we just have to make distinctions in the spirit of Thomas Aquinas. And let's begin with Thomas Aquinas. I have a Muslim friend who's a serious academic, and he said when he reads the first part of the Summa of Aquinas, if you take out the questions on the Trinity, he said, it's a wonderful commentary on the Quran. And what he means is, as Thomas talks about God's existence, God's attributes, God's nature, God's intelligence, his love, his freedom, his simplicity, etc., he said, I resonate totally with that. It's the God that we worship as Allah. Keep in mind, too, that Thomas writes the Summa Contra Gentiles to help Christian missionaries in Muslim lands. And so he was clearly assuming that his more philosophical approach in the Summa Contra Gentiles would appeal to Muslims, that they'd find points of contact there. Another point of reference, I would say, is Vatican II. So in Nostra Aetate, when Vatican II reflects on the religions of the world, it pays a very sincere tribute to Islam. And we'll talk about the various points of contact between our sense of God and Islam's sense of God. God the creator, God who is provident, God who is loving and intelligent, etc. And so I take all these as indicators that, yes, there are very important and serious overlaps between, let's say, a Muslim conception of God and a Christian conception of God. In that sense, sure, we worship the same God. Just as I would say I worship the same God as a Jew, because there's so many points of overlap and contact. If you really want to press it too, go out to Hindu religiosity. Are there points of contact anyway between a Hindu sense of the sacred and a Christian sense of God? Well, sure, points of contact. Fewer than in Islam and Judaism? Yeah, I'd say so. So that's a first step. To say that we're simply in different silos, we are not dealing at all with the same reality, I think is naive. At the same time, is there something truly distinctive about the Christian doctrine of God? And the answer is obviously yes. And here's how I put my finger on it. All the great religions will talk about love as an attribute of God. Love is something that God does or that God has. Christianity is unique in the claim that love is what God is. God is love. Well, see, the minute you say that, you're naming Christian distinctiveness. Why? Because if God is love, then within the very unity of the deity, you must find a lover, a beloved, and shared love. And that's shorthand, if you want, for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Trinitarian God is a now fully articulated sense from a Christian standpoint of who God is. Are we worshiping the same God, let's say Muslims and Christians? Well, no, in the measure that Muslims don't accept the Trinity. So that's, I think, the nuanced way we have to go about it. The answer is, I know it might be unsatisfying, but is a yes and a no. There are very serious points of contact and there are very serious points of demarcation, and both have to be honored.
Next up, we have a great question from Daniel, who's a college student in Los Angeles, and he's wondering whether the church changes her teachings over time. So here's Daniel.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Daniel from Los Angeles. A theologian came to our Newman Center and was talking about perhaps the church changing its interpretation on Humanae Vitae. He used the change of view on usury as an example. Would this actually be an example? Is there any other examples where perhaps the church may have changed some sort of interpretation? Thanks for your time.
Well, these are our searching questions we have today, and it's another, really fundamental one. Here's a quick answer. I know it's a complicated matter. The quick answer is John Henry Newman's answer, which is doctrine, including moral doctrine, develops but doesn't change. Now what does Newman mean by that? Well, just as a little baby develops into a child, into a teenager, into a young adult, into a middle-aged man, into an old man, and undergoes thereby a lot of change. I mean, if you look at a little baby and you look at an old man, you say, well, could that possibly be the same person? So development can be dramatic and can, involve a lot of evolution. At the same time, is that old man the child? Well, yeah. We're not talking about two different beings. We're talking about the development or evolution of one being. Well, in a similar way, Newman says the ideas that make up the doctrine of the church, both kind of theoretical doctrine and moral doctrine, develop, they evolve without changing substantially. In fact, if it does change substantially, that's what Newman would call a devolution or a corruption. So, Humanae Vitae is actually a very interesting example, and Vatican II along with it. The church has long maintained, that the principal end of the sexual act is procreation. So go back to St. Augustine. Thomas would echo him too, for the most part. And that's the purpose of the sexual act. Vatican II and Humanae Vitae represent a real development of doctrine because they say, along with procreation, there's the unitive element of the sexual act. Well, that wasn't in the earlier formulations of the teaching. It evolved, it developed at Vatican II and Humanae Vitae. Could the church come along and say, what Humanae Vitae said is now wrong? Well, no, that would be necessarily a corruption or a devolution. So I'd say evolution, yes, devolution, no. So the language of change of doctrine is dicey because it's very ambiguous. Is evolution a change? Yeah, in one sense it is. But it doesn't mean that there's a complete reversal of what came before. And I think sometimes people will rather cynically use it that way to say, oh, church has changed on these various matters, when I would say it's evolved.
Daniel, Bishop Barron has a wonderful article outlining John Henry Newman's development of Christian doctrine on our website. So I have a link to that on the Word on Fire show website. But in that article, Bishop Barron looks at some of the criteria which determine whether something's a devolution or a true development of doctrine. So be sure to visit wordonfireshow.com and check out that article. Next up, we have a question from Samantha all the way in Australia. And it's something that every Christian has struggled with for the last 2,000 years. It's the question of how do we move into the secular culture and evangelize without being corrupted by that same culture? So here's Samantha's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Samantha from Darwin, Australia. My question is this: how can young Catholics evangelize by being light and salt to the earth without corrupting their own faith and their own morals by hanging out with people who are not of the same faith?
Yeah, thank you for that good question. And you're right, from the far end of the world there in Darwin, Australia. Go back to St. Paul. St. Paul was a very pious Jew, trained at the feet of Gamaliel, the rabbi. He was hyper devoted to the traditions of his people. He was very wary of this new Christian sect that had come along and actively persecuted it. Well, then after his conversion, Paul becomes the great missionary to the Gentiles. In his previous incarnation, I think Paul would have been very wary of Gentiles and would have steered clear of them and felt, I got to maintain the purity of my Judaism. But afterwards, he becomes the great missionary, the great apostle. And we see Paul on the Areopagus. We see him among the intellectuals of ancient Greece. We hear Paul in the public spaces in Corinth, in Philippi, etc. We see Paul going all the way to Rome, where we met his fate. But there he is preaching in the streets of Rome and then writing. Well, what's he doing there? But he is mixing and mingling with what to him would have been deeply not so much secularized, that's our language, but alien cultures alien to what he was propagating. He becomes thereby, and here I'm following Balthazar, he becomes an archetype of the church. So not everyone has this call. So some people have a more Johannine ministry, which is more contemplative, more liturgical, more prayerful. Think of a monk, who is leading a life of intense prayer, but not really dealing with the world all that frequently. Or someone that's really devoted to the liturgy, etc. But there is this Pauline archetype. That's someone that's willing to go out into the wider culture. Here's where you're absolutely right, and it's an important part of your question. It is dangerous. It is dangerous for people to venture outside the church into the wider world because you get exposed to all kinds of things that are problematic, misleading, enticing. Think of someone, and I've done some of this too in my life, who's really dealt with the new atheists. Well, and I know, Brandon, of course, you do it all the time. That's dicey. When you're reading atheist arguments all the time, you're reading attacks on Christianity, you're reading arguments that are good. They're put together by smart people, and they're convincing to a degree. Is that tempting intellectually? Is it a little bit problematic intellectually? Yeah. And see, I think that's the challenge of the Pauline model, is that you're going to go out as an evangelist, as a speaker, but you're going to be in greater danger. So what do? Well, you don't retreat. If that's your calling, and I'm sensing now from our questioner that might be your calling, that you feel a more Pauline kind of impetus to go out. Do it. Don't resist that. But at the same time, you got to be really, really grounded. The danger is someone starts a evangelistic, apologetic, evangelical ministry, but they're not backed up with prayer. They're not backed up with the Mass. They're not backed up with confession, with frequenting all the sacraments. And then you become very vulnerable. You become susceptible to the influences of the wider culture. So I would say keep yourself grounded in a Johannine thing, prayer, liturgy, contemplation, spiritual direction, confession, the Eucharist, the Rosary, the Blessed Sacrament. Be grounded there. And then you'll have the courage and the confidence to go out and meet the wider culture.
Talk about the need also, and you've said this multiple times, for intellectual formation before you go out into a culture that's going to lob challenges and skeptical questions at you. I know when I first started engaging atheists, I read through a slew of answering atheist type books, your own books by Bishop, Dr. Edward Fazer and Trent Horn, William Lane Craig, all these people, because if your first exposure to skeptics are their own arguments or criticisms, you're going to feel like you're just caught under an avalanche. So talk about the need to form yourself intellectually in addition to spiritually.
Yeah, I mean, you need so much more than goodwill. Goodwill is great. I'm all in favor of it. I love it when people have this call, to be more Pauline. But no, you're absolutely right, Brandon. You have to read and read and read and read. You need more than just, hey, I'm willing to serve the church. It's like a doctor going out to, I want to do good, but I'm just bored with all this chemistry and biology and anatomy. Well, I mean, you'll be a lousy doctor and you won't do a lot of good. So you want to do good, terrific, but then get trained the way a doctor gets trained. Become acquainted with the objections to the faith and ways to answer them. As you know, it's a kind of a hobby horse of mine that after Vatican II, we threw away all of our weapons. We thought apologetics was bad form. It was defensive. It was rationalistic. We were hyper confident that the culture would meet us. Well, come on. I mean, the culture came after us with a good deal of venom. And the trouble is, there we were exposed. We didn't have our weapons. And, you get to be a good fighter by using your weapons and getting involved in some fights. And you'll get cut a few times. You'll get wounded a few times. But you're learning the craft and the art of fighting. We need more fighters. Now, I'm an advocate of nonviolence. So don't take it's a metaphor, everybody. But we need fighters in the church who are willing and able and properly trained. I mean, you go into battle and you're not properly trained, you won't do anyone any good, and you'll probably get yourself killed. So get trained, and that means in the spiritual warfare and the intellectual warfare.
We've devoted a few episodes in the past to the value of philosophy for life in general, but also in service of theology. And so next up, we have a question from John asking how we can reawaken a love for philosophy, especially among young people, so that they understand the need for philosophy early in their life. So here's John.
Hi, Bishop Barron and Brendan. John here from Cork in Ireland. Thank you for all you do with your great resources and Word and Fire. I love the episode on Bishop Barron's book, The Priority of Christ. And Bishop Barron sounded like a kid in a candy shop when he was speaking on philosophical issues. My question is, how can we reawaken philosophical thinking in our young people so that they can engage fully with the Lord, both through faith and reason? Thanks again, guys.
Great, thank you from Holy Ireland. I'll be in Ireland next spring, giving a retreat to the priests of Dublin, and of course that's my home country in terms of heritage. I'm all Irish, God help me. Good question. I got into this whole business through philosophy, so I have a great affection for it. It were the arguments of Thomas Aquinas that got me really interested in religious things. I furthermore agree with you that the loss of philosophy has been a huge problem in our culture. So we tend to split things between religion and science, and hence the famous disputes. Are you on the religion side or the science side? And what that does, of course, is it implies that religion is non-scientific. Religion is irrational. It's pre-scientific. It's stupid. I agree with my great mentor, Cardinal George, that said the loss of philosophy as a mediating discipline is part of the problem. Philosophy is a way to use your reason, but to move beyond the merely scientific into questions of greater depth and greater amplitude, if you want. I love the sciences. Don't get me wrong. I've said it a million times. I love the sciences. They're great, but that's not all there is. There's a rational way of exploring reality which is non-scientific. It's the philosophical. Philosophy asks distinctive questions. What is the beautiful? What does it mean to be true? How do you know? What is the good? What makes an act good? What's the nature of being qua being? So, I mean, all scientists talk about being. You have to do that. But being qua being, that's Aristotle's way of formulating the nature of metaphysics. What's the purpose of it all? Where does it all come from? Those are not scientific questions. And here I'm going to resist all those advocates of scientism, right? That want to reduce everything to the scientific method. No, all the questions I just named are philosophical in nature. And what they do is they allow reason to move into a realm that gets closer to the properly religious or theological questions. And that's why I agree with the questioner. It's such an important move. When you eliminate philosophy, then you fall back into this desperate either or. Either you're scientific or you're religious. No, philosophy is a propedeutic, or in Latin we talk about philosophy as the ancilla. It's the handmaid of theology. Thomas Aquinas talks about philosophy as a manuductio, manu by the hand, ducere to lead, right? It's a leading by the hand, the way you lead a child, teaching a child to walk. Philosophical questions orient the mind toward the religious or theological, and that's why it's so important. So what I would do to answer your question very directly is awaken in people a sense of rational wonder, if I can put it that way. Aristotle himself said philosophy begins in wonder, right? The desire to know. Well, to wonder about more than simply how things work or what they're made of, the scientific questions. To wonder about the deeper, more searching realities. That's how you awaken it.
I find as a parent of young kids that it almost comes naturally, that why question. Why this? Why that? Why is the sky that way? Why is the world like this? And so I think inflaming that desire to ask the why questions is a great way to get philosophy going.
Yeah, and let kids do it, right? Because they do it naturally. I have a vivid memory. I was about 8, maybe, and I was at the breakfast table eating cereal, as kids like to do. And the sugar bowl, my little sugar bowl on the table, was empty. I probably just emptied it myself. So I said to my mother, "Oh, we need more sugar." And so she went to the cabinet and she had this big, bag of sugar, and she filled my little container. And then I said, what happens when that gets empty? And she said, oh, I go to the store and I buy another one. And then my mind was lit up. And I said, well, then what do they do when they run out? And she goes, oh, well, then they have to go and someone supplies them with sugar. And then I'd never thought about that. I said, well, what happens when that runs out? And she goes, well, and sugar cane. And I remember my little mind, my 8-year-old mind, was following the trajectory of the contingency arguments. Well, why? Explain. I was following what Lonergan and Aquinas would call the intellectus agens, right? The agent intellect that's always asking, how, why, what, It was the restlessness of the mind. Now, I'm sure at some stage my mother said, shut up and eat your cereal, but that's the way it works, is the child's mind, you're quite right, is naturally philosophical. So encourage it.
Next up is a question from Daniel, who's asking about the difference between faith and belief. And I think he probably has in mind here somebody like Richard Dawkins, who says that faith is belief in spite of, and even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. So faith is sort of a lower form of belief. Here's Daniel's question.
Hello, Brandon. Hello, Bishop. My name is Daniel, and I'm from Rockville, Illinois. I've recently finished reading the Bishop's new book, Vibrant Paradoxes, and enjoyed the article on the art of making distinctions in reference to love and tolerance. So my question is, what is the difference between faith and belief? Are the two interchangeable, or do they stand side by side? Thank you, and God bless.
Well, it depends on what you mean, I suppose. I mean, you could see those two as simply interchangeable. I'd go back to Newman again. If you've got the intestinal fortitude, read the Grammar of Assent, which is Newman's masterpiece. And it's on this question of religious epistemology. How do we know? What are the different levels of knowledge? One of our problems today is I think we fall into this trap of I'm certain or I'm in doubt. I know it scientifically or it's a bunch of nonsense. When in fact the mind, as Newman articulates so beautifully, the mind is a much more subtle process, this manner in which we come to know things. I'll give you a couple examples. There's a lady back in Indian Head Park, Illinois, whom I just spoke to a couple days ago, and I called her Mom. And I've believed all my life that she's my mother. Do I know she's my mother? Well, if by know you mean, am I apodictically certain? Do I have an absolutely compelling, clinching argument? Is it radiantly self-evident? Well, no, it's not. It's none of those things. Well, then, is it just a lot of nonsense? It's just a wild fantasy of mine that lady out there in Indian Head Park is my mother? Well, no. Newman would say, I've come to that extremely persuasive conclusion on the basis of a whole slew of intuitions, arguments, experiences, hunches, intuitions, et cetera, all of which converge on the same point, namely that lady out there is my mother. This is the way Newman argues we typically know most things, right? I'm apodictically certain of what precisely? Ask yourself that question. Apodictically, without the slightest doubt, certain of what? Well, to be honest with you, a handful of things. 99% of what we know, and I'll use the word know, not just vaguely believe, what we know in this illative manner, to use Newman's term. We follow the illative sense, which is this intuition for the convergingly probable arguments for things. Now, if you want to pillory that as mere belief, be my guest. But Newman would say, well, then you're an angel, not a man. In other words, this is the way that human beings actually come to know 99% of what we actually know. So where's religious belief come in? Well, religious belief is on the spectrum. Newman says we know religious things the same way we know everything else, by weighing and assessing, judging, making prudential decisions based on evidence before us. So Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Oh, it's wild fantasy. There's no evidence for it. It's a wild fantasy that for no reason, with no evidence, I just goofily accept. Well, no, that would be superstition. You know, there's a spaceship coming to take us all the way to a planet. I believe in that. Well, that's silly. That's superstition. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now, get N.T. Wright's book if you want, 900 pages on it. Get some, I just finished Carl Olson's book on the resurrection. There's plenty of good reason to believe in the resurrection. Do I have apodictic certitude? Well, no, I don't even know my lady's my mother with apodictic certitude. But in a similar way, I can assess, judge, prudentially evaluate convergingly probable arguments that lead my mind to say, yes, that's true. So I know I've been blathering on here a little bit, but I think this question of belief, knowledge, doubt, read Newman. Read someone like Newman, who's very helpful in showing that everything we know, from my mother's identity to God's existence to quarks and atoms to the resurrection of Jesus, well, in one way, I know them all in a similar way. I know them through this kind of illative process, which is both rational and non-rational, both rational and intuitive, etc. But get the grammar of assent for all the details.
Well, let's close with one question I have. We talk a lot about books on this show, and I know our listeners always love to hear what you're reading. So what are you reading? You're about to go here on vacation. What books do you have lined up?
The one I started on the plane on one of these trips I was just on is Fleming Rutledge's book called The Crucifixion. I read some reviews of this book, and it kind of piqued my interest. Fleming Rutledge is a Anglican priest, and she's also a prominent preacher. I must confess, I'd never heard of her until I read these reviews. And some of the best people around were giving it these rave reviews. So I picked it up. It's a big, thick book, about 700 pages maybe. But man, is it good. It's looking at maybe 5 or 6 models of understanding the crucifixion of Jesus. But she begins with this wonderful evocation of just how strange the crucifixion is. And there she reminds me of Stanley Hauerwas, whom I like very much. Hauerwas, who said that, that we who worship a crucified God have become mainstream. That's the great mystery. That there's something permanently unnerving and weird about the crucifixion. She draws attention to Paul's line in Romans. It's Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, Paul says. Well, she says, well, why would you ever be ashamed of something you're teaching? Would the Buddha ever say, oh, I'm not ashamed of what I'm teaching? Well, no, this is a great teaching and I'm sharing it with you. Muhammad would never say, I'm not ashamed of the Quran. No, of course not. But yet Paul does say that. How come? Her answer is because in the ancient world of that time, there was nothing more shameful than the crucifixion. And to say that somehow that's what you're preaching, that's your message, struck people as beyond bizarre. We who so domesticated the cross, miss that. And if we miss that, we miss everything in Christianity. I like that a lot about her book. That's how she gets into it. Anyway, that's what I'm reading at the moment.
Good. I'm hoping that we can devote at least one episode of this show to that book. So if you're listening to this, maybe you might consider picking up Fleming Rutledge's book on the crucifixion and reading through it so that you'll be well prepared when we do the show. Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. As always, we love to hear from you. So please visit askbishopbarron.com. You can go there to record a question from Bishop Barron. And every episode we choose one, and I think probably in a couple months we'll do another Q&A roundup like this one. Also, if you could please take 5 or 10 seconds and leave a review of this show on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. It gets the show out to many more people. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.